welcome again to the Elixir Poetry Podcast, which is the podcast where we ask people from all around the world if they have a poem that means something to them, and we ask them why. Today we're talking to Emma, who is living in London. Hello, Emma.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here.
We're really happy to have you. It's a wonderful privilege to talk to you. Emma, tell us which is the poem that you would like to read to us.
So my poem is a poem by the Scottish poet Thomas Campbell. It was written in the late 18th century, and it's called Lord Ullin's Daughter. And it's really one of my favourite poems ever.
Wonderful. Okay, so today we have a Scottish poem, a Scottish ballad. Please, would you read it to us, Emma?
I will. Okay, Lord Ullin's Daughter. A chieftain to the Highlands bound cries, "Boatman, do not tarry, and I'll give thee a silver pound to row us o'er the ferry. Now who be ye would cross Loch Gyle, this dark and stormy water? Oh, I'm the chief of Ulva's Isle, and this Lord Ullin's daughter. And fast before her father's men 3 days we fled together, for should he find us in the glen, my blood would stain the heather. His horsemen hard behind us ride, should they our steps discover, then who will cheer my bonny bride when they have slain her lover? Outspoke the hardy Highland wight, I'll go, my chief, I'm ready. It is not for your silver bright, but for your winsome lady. And by my word, the bonny bird in danger shall not tarry, so though the waves are ranging white, I'll row you o'er the ferry. By this the storm grew loud apace, the winter wraith was shrieking, and in the scowl of heaven each face grew dark as they were speaking. But still as wilder blew the wind, and as the night grew drearer, adown the glen rode armed men, their trampling sounded nearer. "Oh, haste thee, haste," the lady cries, "though tempests round us gather, I'll meet the raging of the skies, but not an angry father." The boat has left a stormy land, a stormy sea before her, when, oh, too strong for human hand, the tempest gathered o'er her. And still they rode amidst the roar of waters fast prevailing. Lord Ullin reached that fatal shore, his wrath was changed to wailing. For sore dismayed through storm and shade, his child he did discover. One lovely hand she stretched for aid, and one was round her lover. Come back," he cried in grief, "across this stormy water, and I'll forgive your Highland chief, my daughter, oh, my daughter." 'Twas vain. The loud waves lashed the shore, return or aid preventing. The waters wild went o'er his child, and he was left lamenting.
Oh, Emma, that is just amazing. And it's such a sad story. Such a sad story. Tell me, what does this mean to you, this poem?
So this was when some of my earliest memories of growing up are sitting at my mother's feet. I grew up in the countryside, and sitting at my mother's feet, usually in the dark winter evenings, because in the summer we were out till, late really, playing around in the woods, living kind of wild. But in the dark evenings, one of the ways that as a family we passed the time was to read to each other. And my parents, particularly my mother actually, would always read poetry. And her poems were always sad.
Oh, wow.
But then a lot of poetry is sad, And she had a little book, and I've still got the book right here with me. Paul Graves, actually, a collection of poetry. And this was the book that she used to read from. I've still got her name in the front, and also poems that she copied out, or first lines in her, just writing that she loved. So that means a lot to me too. But this one was always a favourite that she wrote. My mother had she was very, very, when I look back now, I know she must have had elocution lessons, because she came from the Black Country, and she had a sister who spoke with a very thick, broad, Black Country accent. But my mother spoke with a real sort of cut glass accent. And I remember saying to her once, "Why don't you speak in the same way as Auntie Beryl?" And she said, "Oh, I don't know. I just never did. Of course, now I look back and I think in order to get on, she probably had elocution lessons.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sad that she couldn't tell me, but then everyone, why should she? We don't have to tell our children everything. So I remember this voice, this beautiful voice that she used to read this poem to me in with just the right cadence to make it really affecting and really made me cry. And yeah, especially at the end, and when it says one lovely hand was stretched for aid and one was around her lover, and my mother would put the real emphasis on this word lovely, and she would stretch out her hand like the sort of trailing fingers of a ballerina, and I had such a vivid picture in my head, sorry, of this woman, with the waves going over her, and it's still exactly the same image as I've got now.
That is amazing. Your mother sounds amazing as well, but that it is incredibly vivid. You can just imagine. You can just imagine it happening. What's really tragic is the father just begging for her life, and when she's stated she would rather take to the stormy waves than face her father's anger. That's just the most amazing thing, and I think a lot of parents are worried about that their children will hide their suffering, if you like, or their wishes, rather than face up to their parental consternation,
And it was also, even as a small child, I absolutely agree with you, because it was the lines when he's at the shoreline and he calls, let me just see exactly, I'll forgive your Highland chief, my daughter, oh my daughter. Sorry, I still find it really affecting, actually.
Yeah.
So even as a small child, I understood that there he was, sort of, obviously I didn't understand it in these words, but I understood the image that he was, a very important man socially, very powerful in the family, and he ruled with an iron rod. But then when he's on the edge of the law, he's reduced to,
Yeah.
just that.
Yeah. And that idea of the loss of a child through foolish pride, really. I mean, what else you can call it? Through forcing your family to live up to certain conditions, It's just a terrible thing. So, were a lot of the poems ballads that your mother would read to you? Did they have storylines in them? Because this is the first ballad that we've had on the programme.
Yes, very much so, actually, because particularly in this little Paul Graves book, lots and lots of them told stories.
Mm.
I mean, just off the top of my head, I think it's Thomas Hood, isn't it? I remember the house where I was born, the little window where the sun came peeping in at dawn. Often their poems, I mean, poetry often is sad, isn't it? Because it reaches us because of that. So they're often poems about loss, or about foolhardy decisions, or about memory, broken love affairs, So I guess a lot of them were ballads. Yeah, they told stories. Yeah, definitely.
That's really wonderful. I read a little bit. I'd never heard of this poem, so I was reading a little bit about Campbell, and I was really pleased to discover that he was one of the people who set up the University College London.
He did, yeah, he did.
And didn't you go to University College London? I wondered before whether or not that's where you'd come across him. So
I did go to University College London. I studied Russian, first of all, Russian literature at the School for Slavonic and East European Studies, which wasn't part of UCL, but it is now.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did my master's at UCL in comparative literature. And actually, my daughter did her master's at UCL.
So there's a real connection there,
Yeah.
And he wrote this poem when he was really, really young, when he was still at Glasgow University. And I'm not aware, I haven't read any of his other poems, but if that's what he could write when he was still a fledgling, I would like to read some more of his poems.
From what I know about him, they weren't all as this. I think he wasn't very well off. He came from quite an intellectual family. I think he worked for a newspaper for a while. He was always kind of living a bit on the edge financially. I think he edited some books or some poetry of Wordsworth and Coleridge. I think it was either Wordsworth and Coleridge or Wordsworth and Shelley, the great romantic poets. I'm not really aware of sort of other ballads that he may have written, but that there may be lots of them. But I get the feeling that he wrote a sort of quite a wide variety of things. But this one, especially if he wrote it when he was young, it feels, a lot of the time when you read poetry and you read people's very early poetry, for example, Oscar Wilde, for example, Thomas Hardy, so on and so forth. And it's the same with paintings. If you look at early Picasso and so on and so forth, you look at all the early things and you don't get much of an indication that, this person's going to go on and become absolutely sort of tremendous and wonderful, because a lot of the time the early stuff is quite derivative for obvious reasons, because people are just finding their voice or their vision. But for me, this one is, it's completely sort of timeless. You can't really tell if someone was older or younger. It's just fresh. It's almost as if it's a story that he'd heard about and that he wrote, because it just feels completely unpretentious, quite simple language, really, but just so effective and beautiful.
It was really sadly prescient, though, because he had 2 children and lost both of them, one to illness and one to insanity. So when I was reading it again, when you told me what you were going to do, and I was reading a little bit about his life, I was thinking, it's really sad how sometimes the kernel of your life is unwittingly present in your early works.
Well, I guess like Shakespeare losing his child. Yeah, I mean, I guess death and insanity was absolutely, it was all around, in those days, wasn't it? I mean, when people die or a child dies now, it's almost sort of headline news, isn't it? But death was everywhere, absolutely everywhere, in those days. Lord Ullin reached that fatal shore, his wrath was changed to wailing. For sore dismayed through storm and shade, his child he did discover. One lovely hand she stretched for aid, and one was round her lover. Come back, he cried in grief, across this stormy water, and I'll forgive your Highland chief, my daughter, oh, my daughter. 'Twas vain. The loud waves lashed the shore, return or aid preventing. The waters wild went o'er his child, and he was left lamenting. What I also like about the poem, of course, is I like its connection with some of the Shakespeare plays, actually, like Othello, like Romeo and Juliet, obviously, like King Lear. I think it's really interesting that there are these male writers going through the centuries that are writing about hot-headed young women who disobey their authoritarian fathers. But of course, they all come to grief. No one's happily ever after. The same as the 19th century novels, they all have to die in the end.
Yeah.
Like the authors don't really know what to do with them. But I don't think that this is kind of the same, because this is, it's just really fresh and inevitable. It's not as if the author kind of intervened, oh, she must die. It's just so inevitable. There's the contrast between the storm and her father. Which one are you going to do? I don't know. It's like, I hope this doesn't sound too crude and horrible. If it does, you can cut it. But it's like when people are jumping from the Twin Towers. It's certain death if you wait for the fire. If you jump, there's the tiniest hope that somebody might be holding out a blanket, even though that's preposterous and impossible. And I guess if you go across the water, there's the tiniest hope that you might get to the other side. Whereas facing her father, no chance.
Yeah. Well, it's that old adage, nobody jumps out of the window if the room's not on, and it can be on fire psychologically as well as physically,
I mean, I think the other thing I really loved about this poem when I was really young was I didn't understand everything about all the descriptions, because I was read it when I was really young. But to me, when I look back, that's a lesson in, you don't have to understand everything when you're reading it. If something has a power, like a poem or a story, just go with it. Just doesn't matter if there are things you don't understand, because actually that narrative, that beautiful, magical, fantastic power will carry you anyway. You don't need to know every single word.
I love the idea of having poems read, and it's partly why I'm doing this podcast, because they become so real when you're listening to them because you're picturing them, And in this poem, I really don't like to, talk about, use the language of how to write about poetry in this, but the rhythm of this poem is what builds this idea of fate. It is inexorable. Just by the rhythm of it that this is going to end in tears, because fate is beating you down and will beat them down over because of the rhythm it's written in. And it's very fresh, as you say, and very, very vivid and emotional, and you can't get really more emotional than that loss of your child.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's really interesting what you say about the beat or the rhythm, because yes, when I think about it now, because I've only ever considered it in an emotional way, but actually you're completely right. The rhythm is, gosh, I don't want to sound too poety, but it's like the content mirrors the form, doesn't it? So this rhythm is really mirroring the gathering storm.
Yeah.
And the waves as well. And then you get that sort of, the high point where you could almost hear him screaming across the waves, "My daughter, oh my daughter."
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the idea of the sort of lovely hand it's such a kind of it's so different. It's such a contrast because it's so gentle. It's almost they're the only two gentle lines in the poem. One lovely hand she stretched for aid, and one was around her mother. They are so gentle, and everything else, as you say, is beating and beating, the horse's hooves, the glen, the storm, and then the terrible ending.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's amazing. Emma, I've really enjoyed listening to your relationship with this poem, and I would really love it if you would read it to us again so that our listeners can listen to it now, picturing you sitting by your mum's knees, listening to her reading this poem to you of a dark evening. Yeah, I'd love it if you could read that to us again. That would be really lovely.
It was a dark evening, and just to add a few more details, there were crisscross windows because it was a very old house.
Oh, wow.
There were the shadows of the trees outside, and we didn't have central heating, so we had a fire in a hearth side, in our sitting room. So
really atmospheric.
So I was on the hearth.
Yeah.
And my mother, when I was little, she had that, her mother had hair that she could sit on, because that was a sort of a pride thing. Could you sit on your hair? It's like a sort of Victorian kind of goal. So my mother had very long golden hair. And so my mother's golden hair for me used to sort of flicker in the firelight. And of course, in those days, very wrongfully, every princess, apart from Snow White, had golden hair. So to me, it was just incredibly magical. There was this firelight, which was safe, and then the dark outside and the shadows, and then my mother's golden hair, which seemed to be the center, and then this beautiful little book that I'm still holding now, that she held in her lap. Okay. So yes, I'd love to read it.
Okay, thank you.
So Lord Ullin's Daughter by Thomas Campbell. A chieftain to the Highlands bound cries, "Boatman, do not tarry, and I'll give thee a silver pound to row us o'er the ferry. Now who be ye would cross Loch Gyle this dark and stormy water? Oh, I'm the chief of Ulversile, and this Lord Ullin's daughter. And fast before her father's men 3 days we fled together, for should he find us in the glen, my blood would stain the heather. His horsemen hard behind us ride, should they our steps discover, then who will cheer my bonny bride when they have slain her lover? Outspoke the hardy Highland wight, I'll go, my chief, I'm ready. It is not for your silver bright, but for your winsome lady. And by my word, the bonny bird in danger shall not tarry, so though the waves are raging white, I'll row you o'er the ferry. By this the storm grew loud apace, the water wraith was shrieking, and in the scowl of heaven each face grew dark as they were speaking. But still as wilder blew the wind, and as the night grew drearer, adown the glen rode armed men, their trampling sounded nearer. Oh, haste thee, haste, the lady cries, though tempests round us gather, I'll meet the raging of the skies, but not an angry father. The boat has left a stormy land, a stormy sea before her, when, oh, too strong for human hand, the tempest gathered o'er her. And still they rode amidst the roar of waters fast prevailing. Lord Ullin reached that fatal shore, his wrath was changed to wailing. For sore dismayed through storm and shade, his child he did discover. One lovely hand she stretched for aid, and one was round her lover. Come back, he cried in grief across this stormy water, and I'll forgive your Highland chief, my daughter, oh my daughter. 'Twas vain. The loud waves lashed the shore, return or aid preventing. The waters wild went o'er his child, and he was left lamenting.
Oh, that is so moving. And, just the way, I mean, it's so beautifully done, and it seems so simple, the way he moves from daughter to child during the poem, because that vision of what he's losing is his child, How wonderful. Emma,
I also love, sorry,
carry on. No, tell me, carry on.
The last little bit, which I've just sort of realised I love so much, how the face of heaven starts scowling. You know, this very authoritarian idea of God is displeased that you are disobeying your father. You mustn't do this. So, as you say, she didn't stand much of a chance.
Yeah, and it's sort of surreal, this water wraith, you feel as if some water demon has come out to drag her down. It's horrible. This has been really wonderful listening to you talking about this poem, and I'm sure it's a poem that many people actually don't know about. So it's really, really nice. And for our listeners, on my website, on the page for the podcast, I will post for you not only links to Campbell's life and this poem, but I'll also put some links on there to some of Campbell's other poetry from his later life, so that if you fancy researching this Scottish poet, you will be able to do so. And Emma, thank you so much for coming to talk to us about this poem. It's been
thank you very much. I've really had a really lovely time. It's been wonderful.
It's been a real privilege. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you for listening to the Elixir podcast. My name is Helen Wing, and you can find more information about the poems that we talk about on my website at helenwing.com. If you have a poem that you would like to share and would like to appear on the podcast, please contact me at helenwing@me.com. If you're a regular listener and are enjoying the podcast, it would mean the world to me if you could hit the follow button on your podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review and a 5-star rating. This would give us just a little help that will make a great deal of difference. Remember, you can find the poems that feature in each episode on my website, helenwing.com. Thanks for listening.